name is Kevin Peters, and I'll be walking you through the creation of a BIRT dataset using the OpenMRS ODA. So once you have the ODA set up and working in your BIRT instance, the first thing you'll want to do is create a new data source, which you should see listed as OpenMRS data source. In my case, I'll just call my data source OpenMRS. The next screen, you have to enter the URL for your OpenMRS instance as well as the username and password. In my case, it's on localhost port 8080, and you can click the test connection button to make sure that the ODA can reach your data source, and in this case it can. It says ping succeeded. So click OK and then finish to create my data source. So now that I have a data source in BIRT, I can create my data set off of this data source. So as you can see from the drop down here in the middle, my OpenMRS data source that I just created is here. So give your data set a name. I'll just call this one patients, and click the next button. So this is the first screen that you'll see, and this allows you to choose the tokens or the concepts that you want to report off of. The first thing you need to do is choose your filter or cohort from the drop down. Once you choose that, you'll then see that the token tag drop down is populated, as well as you now have a choice of columns here on this left box. So if you had token tags set up within your instance, you could choose them here to further narrow things down, and you can also use this find tokens feature to narrow down the tokens that you want to select. So in this case, let's add a few. Say age, and I can use these arrows right here to move age onto the selected box here on the right hand side. We'll also add gender, and instead of using the arrows, this time I can just double click it and it will also go over there. We'll add a couple others, weight, height, and that's good for now. Okay, so now I have my 4 tokens selected. I'm going to click finish. And the first screen that comes up in the edit dataset shows me my output columns. So the first thing you'll notice is the first column is patient ID. This will always be selected no matter what, so you have a way to reference the data that's returned to you to a patient. Then I have these columns down here for each of the tokens that I selected. I have just age, which is the value, but then I have these other columns that are associated: observation date, observation location, encounter date, encounter type. And I have those for each of those. You can see that for gender and height and weight as well. And this just gives me more information about the token that I selected besides the value. Okay, so now I'll show you the other screens. First we'll go back. If you click the select tokens here, you'll see basically the same screen from when you initially created your data set. Here you can continue to add and remove tokens as you wish. For instance, if we wanted to add temperature, we could add that. And then when we go back to the output columns, you'll now see that we have temperature. So you have your columns selected. Now there's another screen that you can click, the modify tokens. Now at the top here, this allows me to choose the aggregates and the values for the individual tokens I've selected: age, gender, height, temperature, and weight. In this case, because of the default data style I'm using, we don't have the option to change the aggregates, and we'll talk more about data styles in a little bit. However, I can select my individual tokens, for instance height, and down at the bottom screen I have a list of modifiers to choose from. So in order to enable a modifier, I'll check the box and provide it an option. For instance, in this case, maybe I want all weights that are, all heights that are less than 300. And maybe we want all heights that are also greater than 200. I can provide multiple modifiers for the individual height token, and I can specify the precedence if the precedence is applicable by clicking the individual token or the individual modifier rows and using the arrow here to move them up and down to specify what I would like to be evaluated first. I can do this for all the tokens. I can click these around, and you can see if I go back to my height that there are my modifiers again. So I'm just going to disable these because I'm not really interested in modifiers for this session. Okay, so now I'm going to go to show you the split tokens. Now, split tokens, as you recalled from looking at the output columns, we had other columns associated with the values besides just the value. For instance, in this case we're supporting observation date, observation location, encounter date, and encounter type. I'm not interested in any of these for age and gender because I don't really care when that was observed and how it was observed. So I can uncheck those, but I still am interested in all the information for height, temperature, and weight. So I'm going to leave all those checkboxes checked. And if you go back to the output columns, you'll see that I now only have one column associated with age and gender, but I still have my height, temperature, and weight, and all the other associated columns like observation date, observation location, encounter date, and encounter type. Okay, so now I've got my data set kind of the way I want it, so let me just do a quick preview and make sure that I'm getting data back. So I'll click the preview results and wait for my query to be ran and the data returned. Okay, so you can see here that I have a row for each of the patients, and it shows me their age, gender, height, when the height was recorded, the observation date, observation location, etc. And I can go scan over and I can see that I have the same for temperature. It shows the temperature of the patient, when that was recorded, and then weight. So now is a good time to mention that this data set, or this data style that I'm using, is the default data style, which is called the most recent. And this will return the most recent information for the patient based on the tokens that were selected. So for instance, in this case, the 168 centimeters was the last height that was recorded for this patient, 70137. So I'm limited to where I just have the most recent data of the patient. So that brings me to the next screen. We'll look at View OpenMRS Query. The top up here shows you what the actual query looks like that's being sent over the line to the Logic web service. This is useful for troubleshooting, and if any issues are ran into, the query can actually be looked at and examined for any problems. Down here at the bottom, though, is how you select the data style. As you can see, I have the most recent selected by default, which is what I mentioned, just returns the most recent data for the patient. However, I may be interested in much more information than just the most recent information. So I have these other styles, which are a stacked data style. Let me select that, and just to illustrate what that does, I'll go back to the output columns. And as you can see, I have much fewer columns now. I just have a patient ID, a token, a value column, and then I have the other splitter columns as well, the observation date, observation location, encounter date, and encounter type. So this is a much more stacked data style, whereas I will get multiple rows back per patient. That indicates not just their most recent data, but more data than that. So that brings me to the Modify Tokens screen again. As you remember, I only had the aggregate and the aggregate value were grayed out using the most recent. But now that I can get more data than just the most recent, I have the option to choose an aggregate name, for instance, first, last, max, min, and then how many I want of those values. So for instance, instead of just getting the last height for the patient, maybe I want to get the last 6 heights for that patient. So I can change that here. And when I run the query, I'll get that data appropriately. So the third data style is flat. Now this flat data style is more of a better for consuming in a spreadsheet where you have a large number of columns. This will give you more than the most recent data for the patient, but it'll give you just one row per patient. So you could imagine you could have a large number of columns. And to illustrate that, we can go back to the output columns. And as you can see, I chose earlier when I chose the last 6 heights. Now you can see here that I have 6 sets of height columns, all with observation date, location, etc., with the little underscore notation here. But my temperature, I still just have _1 and _1 for weight as well, because I only chose one column. I could go back to my modify tokens and say give me the last 3 temperatures, and then go back to my output column, and you can see that I'll now have 3 sets of columns for my temperature and still just one for weight. And I'll go ahead and just preview the results just to make sure everything's still working. And you see here I still have my list of patients with their ages and gender, height, but now I have much more values for my height. See, some of these patients didn't have multiple values, but these ones on the top had more than one height recording. And we can keep scrolling over. As you can see, there weren't a lot of heights recorded for this data set. And now we're going to our temperature, where we chose the last 3 temperatures. And you can see that we now have more information than just the last temperature. For that patient, we can see the temperature over time. Okay, so I'm going to go back to just the default data style. Let me shrink this window here and show my output columns. And now you can see I'm back to normal, where I just have the patient, the age and gender with no splitter columns because I removed those earlier, and then I just have my most recent height, temperature, and weight. So once you're satisfied with your data set, and you can reopen this later and go back and modify it as wish, you click OK. And now you see I have my data set here in BIRT, and I can do whatever I want to report with it. Just as a simple example, I'll move the whole table that I selected into the report. Just do a quick preview of the data here. And you can see here's all of my data that I saw in the data preview, where I can have it all in BIRT to do all the formatting and different reporting, use the different reporting tools that BIRT has to offer. So this is a very quick tutorial over how to set up your data set, and I hope you found it useful and you're able to create successful BIRT reports with the OpenMRS ODA. Thanks for your time.